Thank you to the Press Club for organising those fine sandwiches. The topic is Trump's treatment of NATO allies has cast doubt on American reliability. Understatement. If we're faced with a different and less reliable America, how do we defend ourselves? And so we'll start with Sam Roggeveen, am I right, who's a director of the Lowy Institute, author of the Echidna Strategy, Australia's Search for Power and Peace. He was a senior strategic analyst at the Office of National Assessments and an analyst in the Defence Intelligence Organisation. Sam.
Well, thank you, Malcolm, for the introduction and for bringing us together today. I'd like to start with a simple declaration. Australia can defend itself with a less reliable American alliance partner. In fact, in the worst case, Australia can defend itself even if there is no alliance at all. And I'd like to examine that issue in two ways, as a military problem and as a political one. The military problem, it seems to me, is relatively straightforward. Australia is not that hard to defend. We're not Taiwan or South Korea or Israel or Poland. We don't have an enemy on our doorstep. Beijing's closer to Berlin than it is to Sydney. And when it comes to the use of force against Australia, distance matters a great deal. Being far away from threats remains a tremendous asset. The 2024 National Defence Strategy says technology has already overturned one of Australia's long-standing advantages, geography. Overturned. That is a substantial overstatement. The Chinese naval flotilla that recently circumnavigated Australia had to make a journey of over 7,000 kilometres just to sit off the coast of Eden to conduct gunnery practice. In wartime, if it hadn't been sunk first, it could have delivered at best a few dozen cruise missiles onto our landmass. Now, of course, in years to come, the Chinese fleets are going to get bigger. China will deploy new bombers too and more missiles. So Australia's task is to build the capacity to sink the ships and the submarines that threaten us and to shoot down the incoming aircraft and missiles. That task is going to get harder as China's power grows, but it's perfectly achievable for Australia, even, as I say, in the worst case, without the alliance. But the starting point must be to use distance to our advantage. At present, we're treating it as a barrier to be overcome. That's what AUKUS is about. Now, I say, if China ever wants to threaten Australia, let the PLA cross that distance. Our task, when the ships and missiles and aircraft get close enough, is to cause them unacceptable damage. Now, I've called this an Echidna strategy, and I grant the echidna is a slightly ponderous, even comical creature, but it's hardy, it's a survivor, and it's perfectly adapted to its environment. With an Echidna strategy, Australia looks benign and friendly to nations that mean us no harm, and it looks spiky and indigestible to those that do. But if the military problem is eminently solvable, that still leaves the politics. It seems we're not content with the strategic gift handed to us by our favourable geography. We yearn to be relevant. We want to be with the Americans at the head table, and we fear being left out of their considerations. AUKUS is a symptom of this anxiety. After all, on the day AUKUS was announced, I doubt any fair-minded Australian would have said that the alliance was in trouble and that a $368 billion gesture was required to rescue it. In fact, the alliance was already in rude health, as intimate as it had ever been. So when AUKUS was announced on the 15th of September 2021, it resembled a bizarre scene at an auction. The hammer had already come down. The auctioneer had announced sold to Australia, to which Australia responded, "Thank you, but we'd like to make another bid." I don't want to be too glib. Reliance on great powers made sense for Australia, but not anymore. And I'm not referring to President Trump. We now have 2 months of evidence suggesting that he simply won't meet his commitments to allies. But I would stress it's only 2 months. We ought to consider more evidence than that. The trouble for alliance supporters is that a longer historical gaze brings no more comfort because we can see a long succession of unmet American promises to prioritise Asia. In the face of China's dramatic military modernisation, the US has done little. US forces deployed to Asia today are roughly the same size as in 1991. But let's not blame the Americans. It's perfectly rational behaviour. Taking on China would be a daunting task, the hardest thing America has ever had to do as a great power. But it's not an essential task because the US is a highly secure country which will remain perfectly safe, even in the unlikely event that China dominates Asia. American power isn't suddenly evaporating under Trump. The evidence has been clear for many years. The US is simply not committed to defending its position as the leading power in Asia. It's just that previous administrations disguised this fact with pretty language about pivots and rebalances. Our political leaders were either fooled by this or they chose to fool themselves. Well, the veil has now been lifted and we're left to sort things out for ourselves. It won't be the first time Australia has been forced to be free. The fall of Singapore, east of Suez, the Guam Doctrine, the stillborn pivot to Asia, the abandoned Trans-Pacific Partnership. Throughout our history, Australia has had to grasp independence by degrees. The steady retreat of American influence in Asia, now accelerated under Trump, merely completes that evolution. But although Australia fears abandonment, when it actually happens, we cope with it remarkably well because we're sober, practical, problem-solving people. So when I hear that Australia cannot defend itself without America, I don't detect an argument about military capability or force structure, but a timidity that's completely at odds with what we've achieved as a nation. We've always done the big things our own way. The Australian ballot, compulsory voting, federalism, superannuation, health, education, immigration, firearms. Why not defence? There's no reason for Australia to lack self-confidence. Now, I began by saying that Australia can defend itself with a less reliable America. And I would end by saying that we must. There's no going back to the late 20th century American dominance of Asia. This isn't about Trump, and it isn't a passing storm. America won't return to normal. We need to plan for a more independent post-American future, not out of misplaced nationalism, and certainly not out of spite or animus towards the Americans. We should do it because we must. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Sam. Our next speaker is Major General Mick Ryan. Mick served for 35 years in the Australian Army, including in East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as on the US Joint Staff in Washington. He's been an extraordinary student of the war in Ukraine, and because of his writing about that war and support for its efforts, he was sanctioned by the Russian government in 2022, another badge of honour. Mick.
Thanks, Malcolm. You didn't mention that when I was a brigade commander, I actually hosted Malcolm as Prime Minister, and that was a very adventurous day. My first love, I guess, the thing I study most is warfare. Not the war in Ukraine or Israel, but how nations come together to build the capacity to deter conflict, and if they can't deter it, to win it. And in most of my conversations I've had in Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan and other places in the last few years, probably only 50% of those conversations are with military people, because defending yourself, deterring against aggression is a national endeavour. So a lot of the things I'll talk about today really are about national rather than ADF things. There's still things to fix though. But I think the most important thing we need to do as a nation is to have a reinvigorated conversation about national security. Because Australians by nature are pretty complacent about defence because we are so far away. And because of that natural complacency, there's a natural tendency in the political class not to have to worry about it, not to chase votes over it, not to have honest conversations. And it's a self-reinforcing doom loop. We need to break that. And I think the way we do that is actually developing a national security strategy for this country. It is unbelievable to me that a sophisticated, wealthy country like Australia is not able to produce a strategy that outlines a national approach to its security and its prosperity. And why would we do that? Well, obviously we want to have about integrated national and federal and state approaches about all the agencies of security. But I think the most important purpose is to have an honest conversation with the Australian people about the magnitude of the threats that are posed to our nation at the moment, not just by China, but this authoritarian alignment of China, Russia, Iran and North Korea, which is a learning and adaptation block that we have never seen before. And we have to have a government fill the information vacuum on national security that's filled by talking heads like me. And we need to have this conversation, and a very honest one, and it needs to include resources and what is the right percentage of GDP to spend on defence. An element of that, and a second priority, must be addressing our national resilience and capacity. We're already a laggard when it comes to fuel reserves and these kind of issues, and people like Chris Barry, JB Blackburn and others have done terrific research and briefing on that. But it also includes physical resilience, about hardening our communications infrastructure. It includes our defence industry in this country, which is lagging behind because we're not investing enough in it. And there's a lot more that it can do to help defend this country other than just always seemingly ending up with the American major contractors. A third issue, and this is, I think, a really significant concern now, is cognitive warfare and the information space. I think our country has stepped back from trying to be better at strategic influence in our region, and we've stepped back from informing our own people about defence and national security priorities, and it's left a gap for Chinese, Russian and other malign actors to undertake not just disinformation operations, but cognitive warfare, which is about how people think and how they see their government and how they have confidence in their own institutions. I think we really need more research, we need to invest in this, and we need to decide not just what we're going to do to defend against it, to build a more resilient society, but are we going to engage in this behaviour against our adversaries? Two final issues. I think the ADF at the moment is out of balance. In fact, it's not even a balanced ADF anymore, according to the National Defence Strategy. It's a focused force, which I think is a terrible construct, because what it does in many respects is assume we know all the threats we have to deal with. That's not true. We have a perfect record of never predicting the next military deployment or next war. We need a balanced force, not to keep the services happy, but to have greater capacity to adapt to surprise. But the balanced force we need of the future needs a whole range of different balances. It needs a greater balance of exquisite and cheap capabilities. It needs a different balance of crewed and uncrewed capabilities. It needs a different balance of long and short-range combat capabilities. And it needs a different balance of professional and citizen service people. Finally, to do this, if you've read my article in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning, you know that first and foremost I'm all about we need good leadership to do this. None of this is possible without the right kind of political leadership and then leadership at the departmental and military levels. It will require different incentives for thinking, for risk-taking, and promotion constructs which at the moment do not reward any form of risk-taking by and large. We need just as many rat catchers as regulators, and that has not been the case in the last 20 years. And at the same time, we need an ADF leadership that is actually visible in this country. They have been, for the last quarter of a century, constrained in their ability to have conversations in public about the challenges we face and to explain the technical solutions available, or to explain the kind of lessons of modern warfare by which we've been given a masterclass in the last few years. Finally, we need to sort out some civil-military problems in this country. We don't have a theory of how civil-military relations work in this country. We have a constitution, we have a Defence Act, but these are merely technical. We need a clear idea of how the military and the government should interact, including who says what publicly, about how the military and the bureaucracy interacts, and about how the military and society interacts. And all this will take good leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is retired Brigadier, now Professor Ian Langford, DSC and BARS, who served for more than 31 years in the Australian Defence Force, as a senior officer. He's the Executive Director of Security and Defence Plus, a research initiative between King's College London, Arizona State University and the University of New South Wales.
Thanks, Malcolm. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Great pleasure to be here. My university appointments give me a real insight because I spend an equal amount of time in all three AUKUS jurisdictions. Thankfully, I get pretty high-level access to decision makers and those that think about policy. And there's two elements of the question I want to answer or address today, and that is the different environment we're in now and the so what. And I thought in doing so, I want to give you a context, a snapshot of the last 3 weeks, which has spent time in Arizona specifically, in Washington, DC and New York. And these are all observations, not judgments, but they become pretty important to the context in which I'll frame the so what response. So we're 60 days into the 47th presidency. Some would say in DC, shocking, not surprising. 73 executive orders and counting. Big focus immigration, obviously. Doge, 200,000 to 300,000 people from the federal government workforce will be dismissed. It'll save about 75 billion in salaries a year. Put that in the context of a national debt of 35 plus trillion, doesn't do much. 16% of NASA is gone, having been dismissed. We've got energy dominance, which is quickly becoming the hard edge of US policy in terms of how it imagines a reinvigorated version of itself. And clearly we've got movement in national security and foreign policy. Inside the White House, there are essentially four groups. There is the MAGA group, led by the Vice President, assisted by Donald Jr., and their aim is to entrench a Republican dynasty from here on in. We've then got the mega-rich confidants, that's Lutnick, Navarro and Musk, all independent billionaires in their own right, all focused on cutting deals, and that includes foreign policy. And then we've got the traditionalists, which is focused on Rubio, Waltz and Ratcliffe, who really want to shift the centre of US foreign policy to the Indo-Pacific, and they're waiting on a fourth group that's currently leaderless in terms of how to execute that plan. Of note, Office of Net Assessments has been dissolved. Andy Marshall, most of you would know him, they use that contestability function in the Pentagon to make decisions that prevaricated around issues and challenges in the Cold War and beyond. Voice of America is gone. AUKUS support, and this is in the context of what the US administration officials believe, is that AUKUS exists and enjoys support in large part to the lobbying coming out of the Australian Embassy, which is a credit to them. But certainly Trumpism has now animated other countries, Hungary, Turkey, central governments of Latin America, so on and so forth. Unlike the tariffs of 2016, this time round, the Chinese are not backing down. They are ready to be able to negotiate in the context of tariffs, both for leverage and reciprocity as it relates to how the world will work, and of course the 2nd of April being a key date in that regard. On to the topic of what we're going to do about it, and specific today I want to talk about AUKUS Pillar 2. Good discussion on Pillar 1 this morning, I won't relitigate that. Many of you were around on 16 September 2021 when AUKUS was first announced. Pillar 2 was announced alongside it. In it, we were thinking about how to leverage technology and the collective offset advantage of the three AUKUS members to be able to achieve an asymmetry that others don't have. To give you my hypothesis, when I think about AUKUS Pillar 2, I see it as the offset or even the plan B to Pillar 1. And that's not a judgment around Pillar 1's achievability. It's more about strategic surprise. What if, for example, the ability to remain undetected at sea, at depth, is diminished or eradicated through to a technology breakthrough in the next 10 to 15 years, which doesn't invalidate submarines, but certainly in the more shallow parts of the 9-dash line certainly brings compromise to that key fundamental ingredient. To me, Pillar 2 is about discovering a technology offset like that that gets us there first. And so many of the discussions as it relates to Pillar 2 tends to reduce quickly to some key technology foundations, and we know that we've got vectors around undersea capability, quantum, AI, advanced cyber, hypersonics, counter-hypersonics, electronic warfare, and then space domain awareness. We understand that. They're all worthy pursuits, but to my mind, what's lacking in the Pillar 2 conversation is the offset asymmetry that brings it a levity and a consequence that we hope Pillar 1 will give us. And so in thinking about Pillar 2, I think one of the realisations and the discovery of the three nations in its execution since 2021 is that most of our research capacity sits outside government, inside our universities, activating that as a challenge, understanding how quickly technology and its evolution is impacting the lived experience, not only in military power but in national power. A couple of examples, we've got 33 global subsea cables that matter at the moment, 7 touch Australia, 5 have been announced in the past year alone. We've got Australia to South America Direct, we've got Australia to Africa Direct coming in terms of the Global South, and we've got a PLA survey ship off Victoria this morning potentially surveying those undersea cables and what it may or may not mean in terms of continuity. I'd defer to Mick to perhaps talk about this in Q&A, but if you adopt the traditional threshold of what constitutes armed conflict, if you think about our warfighting domains, not only land, maritime and air, but also space and cyber, my view is that we've already crossed that threshold of definition. We are in a state of armed conflict in space and in cyber right now. If it drifts into the terrestrial layer, which means blood start getting spilt, and it's about the imposition of will through violence, then we don't want to be surprised by that. The amount of partners and other countries and think tanks and independents that I ran into over the past 3 weeks, they are all thinking about Plan B. They're not stepping back from their relationship or their dependencies with the US, but they are necessitated as a moral virtue on behalf of their constituencies to wonder what a Plan B looks like, and in the event of that having to be activated, how that might take shape or form. So in terms of what work has been done for Pillar 2 as it relates to our war plans, we've got good work happening with ITAR reforms, with the Defence Production Act reforms, and that's all very welcome. Australian being designated as domestic manufacturing, US supply chain is all very welcome. But again, it can't just be specific to problems that will be solved in 2032, 33. We're talking about problems that need to be solved as early as 2027 moving right. And again, Pillar 2 is one of those vectors where we can invite that level of change and transformation depending on the problem you're trying to solve. But for a middle power that relies on its alliance network to manage its place in the international system up until this point, we need to think about technology breakthroughs that can achieve an offset and an asymmetry that is of the levity and of the level that Pillar 1 hopes to achieve, albeit a little bit later than we'd prefer. So the last part is really, how does this tie to defending Australia? And I think, again, what we see in Ukraine is about the rapidly changing character of conflict itself. The question as to whether a biennial defence update can keep pace with what's happening is a good one. I knew Ashton Carter quite well before he passed on. He's the father of better buying power in terms of how to bring acquisition and innovation together inside that cycle. He would talk to you about flexible mass production. He'd talk about pushing end users further into production cycles. He's talking about this thing, there's no such thing as M-Day. A lot of talk about mobilisation, a lot of talk about mobilisation plans. There won't be a Pearl Harbor this time where we get to be outraged, nationalise will, spend 3 years getting ready and then out-industry the Axis powers. It's not going to happen this time. The question around M-Day as it relates to war plans and our security is something that we need to think about in the context of continuity. It's got to happen now. It won't be the issuance of a Commonwealth War Book and then we get after it. Clearly, the changing character of conflict, the changing state of the international system is telling us that. And just in terms of summary, in terms of Pillar 2 and doing it differently, fortunately spent a lot of time with private equity and venture capital in New York. I'm not a technologist and I don't forgive the private sector for its strengths and weaknesses, but what I would say is rather than litigate whether or not Pillar 2 has a line item in the capital investment program or in the integrated investment program in Australia, perhaps we should think about things like special purpose vehicles where we can use private capital and deploy it quickly around these technology sets that have a dual purpose. There is hundreds of billions of dollars trying to find places to invest as cash becomes less reliable over the next 5 to 10 years in the US, in Australia and in the UK. That money is looking for opportunity. So let's unleash those sectors. Evidence of that, Red Dragon, which landed the commercial spacecraft on the moon a couple of weeks ago, had a market cap left of launch, had a market cap right of launch. It's transformational. That private capital is flooded into that company as it looks for opportunity. Put that in a military capability context. Think about Stargate, which obviously President Trump has announced as it relates to resiliency around technology sectors in the US. $330 billion US was invested onshore in the 10 years prior from technology. Since the 20th of January, $550 billion has been invested onshore around Stargate. That's all private money, and it's about building that technology uplift inside the US, which I think is something that we might choose to emulate in terms of what our part in that drama looks like when it comes to offset capability and how we might use technology to build the more fundamental and safer version of ourselves going forward. Last point I'll make is around obviously critical minerals. Some people call it AUKUS Pillar 3. It's certainly worth thinking about as it relates to the deposits that we have here, notwithstanding that 90% of critical minerals are refined in China. There are mines around critical minerals on the mainland where you walk into proximity of that mine, there's not a tree growing, no one lives over the age of 30, and nothing's going to live happily there for 500 years. How you do it safely, how you do it efficiently is hard, but again, like Pillar 1, Pillar 2, thinking about a bigger version of ourselves with the assets we have, with the technology advantage we have in mining, we can do something about this and build Pillar 1, Pillar 2, Pillar 3 out in a way that treats problems now and anticipates problems in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. I'm going to have a call on a few people here, but you finished with critical minerals, and I'm looking right at someone who knows more about them than just about anyone I know, Nick Curtis, former founder of Linus.
Need a mic.
It was great, Ian, to have you move this from hardware and defence to the broader problem, a national problem of knowledge and skills. Certainly critical minerals, we have the knowledge and skills. I'm not going to go there at this stage. I'd like to focus on your Pillar 2 for a moment and actually ask a question that really stems back to the Huawei question, I'll call it, which is that we have now, and it's not widely been discussed, been granted by the Biden administration, which goes to show that Sam was correct, this preceded Trump, a further refinement of the China Chips Act, which is called the AI Diffusion Framework, which actually tiers countries in the world as to what they can receive with respect to chips and technology, and most importantly, model weights to do with the big LLM models that are being developed in the US. And Australia has been granted a gift by the US of being one of the tier 1 countries. There are only 18 in the world, there are only 3 effective ones in Asia. It makes me ask, and we have an opportunity, therefore, to take a preeminent position in both hardware and software associated with AI development, really large-scale AI development to your tier 2. However, we will do so under a regime which has put, a regime from the US, which has put regulations in place which require the US to be the dominant and exceptional party in the US first. You can have it, but you must play by these rules which allow the exceptionalism of the US in this to be preserved. That, of course, is going to be challenged heavily by China, and we're going to have more Huawei situations where the question is asked, where do we go? Do we have to go with the US, with the implications that I think will be quite strong about where our alliances are, or are we able to take the Chinese technology and move independently from that? It seems to me it's going to be quite an important question in the very near term. So I really wanted to ask the panel's view of how do we deal with that?
Well,
So thank you very much for your question. As it turns out, I mean, I'm helping through Arizona State University, the foundry that's been established west of Phoenix, and we're doing market entry for Australian companies to get inside that supply chain because they just can't actualise their business model here in Australia for all sorts of reasons. But I think we're so far intertwined now in the US technology chain that we've got to continue to invest on that front. I mean, DeepSeek as an asymmetry comes in the face of apparently it cost $6 million to develop and it didn't use the kind of power capacity that we know we need to use. Now again, that's probably questionable, but just quickly on power, 64 megawatts 2 years ago in the US for data centres, 30,500 megawatts now required 2 years later. So you can see why the energy dominance dimension to this is so important. But the CHIPS Act and certainly efforts like the foundry in Phoenix are going to have that halo and water flow effect on what's happening here in Australia. But I mean, if ANZUS means anything in the context of our dependencies, those emerging technologies, it's still the case that that will remain regardless of AUKUS or not. And I think there's a trust dimension to what's in China, regardless of how technologically attractive it might be, that will prohibit us, because we're not going to be able to knowledge share with the Americans and have Chinese infrastructure inside our critical systems, would be sort of my premise to that.
Thank you. Now, is Mike Pizzullo still here? Where's Mike? Oh, there
he is.
There. Okay. You really are sort of the Prince of Darkness, aren't you? There at the corner.
He's on your left, Malcolm.
No, I know.
Unusual.
It's very rare for Mike to be on my left. But anyway, Mike, so please.
Well, thank you so much, Malcolm. I'd like to ask each of the three panel members, and picking up Dennis's unremarked upon point about contradiction and consistency, and the desire for too much consistency, as I understood Dennis, and not accepting enough of contradiction. Sam, let's just imagine for a moment that everyone in this room would want Australia to be able to defend itself, and principally using its own combat forces, which was a policy first promulgated in those terms by the Hawke government, and Gareth was a minister in that government along with Beazley, and they said we must be able to defend ourselves with our own combat forces. There was a very clear formula in the 87 white paper that derived from the work that Paul Dibb had done a year before. And a number of us have repeated that formula since. Hugh, when he did the 2000 white paper, when I did the 09 white paper for Rudd. It's been a standard formula. However, and I want to ask each of the three members, do we go full Sweden, knowing what Sweden's now done, and say we want to be so reliant that we're going to develop our own technologies, our own intelligence capabilities, our own missile systems, which is what Sweden did for a long time, and it proved ineffectual. They raced into NATO sooner than you can say, you know what, when.
In Swedish, presumably.
Say again?
Yeah, presumably they said it in Swedish, but anyway, go on.
They would have, Malcolm. Yeah. It's a very astute observation. But in terms of the capability we need to do the sorts of things that you most directly said, Sam, and Mick and Ian have touched upon, do we walk away from things like the Tomahawk missile system that finally we're going to acquire, announced 16 years ago by Rudd? Do we walk away from the Mark 48 torpedoes if we ever get the submarines that we talked about? We won't go back over that. Do we walk away from the Mark 48? Do we walk away from the missile systems that the US Navy's developed, the SM2s, the SM6s, and desirably the SM3 for missile interception? Yes or no? I'm happy to hear some ambiguity if there's contradictions there that you're happy to live with, but I principally would like a yes or no from each of the panel members. Thank you.
Well, up to you. He can't make you answer, you know. You can take the fifth.
No, that's all right. My answer's no. But it's perhaps a slightly more tentative no than I would have offered a couple of months ago. My argument about the alliance has always been similar to Hugh's, which is that it would be a tremendous act of self-harm for Australia to walk away from the alliance, and the far bigger danger is that the alliance moves away from us. Yeah. And I do think that is still it's self-evident now that that's the most likely scenario. But I've also argued in the past that the form that will take is actually quite subtle and psychological rather than actual, in the sense that I don't expect a joint ceremony in Darwin where flags get lowered and the Americans formally withdraw, their marine units and so on, and there's an act of parliament where we abrogate the alliance. I don't think any of that will ever happen in our lifetimes. What happens though is in our minds and in the minds of our adversaries, the alliance stops having a deterrence effect because we no longer believe that the Americans will come to our defence in an emergency. That's the part that's going to change. So that's where I think the alliance will leave us in that psychological sense. But within that basic framework, there is still plenty of room for cooperation between the United States and Australia. There's still plenty of room for the Five Eyes, for joint exercises, and for weapons sales. Now, the reason I'm slightly more tentative in my answer there than I would have been 2 months ago is that we've now got the Canadians saying that, well, maybe the F-35 is not such a great idea.
And the Portuguese.
And we've got the Portuguese, indeed, and the Poles talking about developing their own nuclear weapons. I tend to think over the long term, and I said in my remarks, we've only got 2 months of evidence, so we should wait. And I think over the course of this administration, I think simple market forces will assert themselves here. There is simply too much money at stake for arms manufacturers for the Americans to shoot themselves in the foot this way by gifting large military contracts to the Europeans where they don't have to. So I actually don't think that will be a huge problem in the future. And despite the shifting psychology of the alliance, most of its bricks and mortar will remain in place for as long as we can imagine.
Mick?
No, but I think there's a whole lot of complementary capabilities to those exquisite US systems that we might look at. A couple of examples. One, Ukraine's long-range strike capability did not exist 3 years ago. Now is an integrated system with former Soviet, US weapons, European weapons and indigenously developed weapons that include drones, missiles and other things, and intelligence feeds, largely still from the Americans, about 80%. That's a problem. That would be where I'm looking at for diversity of input. But I think a complementary approach like that is the way to go, because there are some exquisite systems from the Americans that just aren't available anywhere else. The second case I'd use is Poland. Now, I've been there a dozen times in the last 3 years, spoken to people at every level from the president down. They very deliberately have a strategy of diversity in supply, as long as that diversity doesn't include Germany. They bought a couple thousand new main battle tanks from the United States and Korea. They've done the same with HIMARS and the Korean equivalent. So, there's some interesting models that we can look at there. It's not a yes or no. I think there's an integrated approach. And frankly, there's a whole bunch of drone builders and small boat builders in this country and sensor builders that we could probably look at a second time and invest in, not just for defence, but for a whole range of public safety applications to build the size of the market.
Mick, could you just before we go to Ian, could you just comment on the amount of Australian technology that is being incorporated in these newly developed Ukrainian weapon systems?
Not a lot. We've probably sent about 4,000 drones all up. Right. And these are fairly low-end things, but there's a whole lot of stuff that's going on that's not publicised around sensors, some rocket stuff, and some other things. It's very interesting.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Ian?
Yeah, and just to reinforce the points already made, no, Mike's earlier part of his question's interesting. I think as a percentage of total government spend, defence is either going sideways or backwards in the budget. So you can talk about ambition, but a strategy without resources is not a strategy. So that conversation hasn't been had with the Australian people yet. What are you willing to forego in order to maximise your defence capability? And that's, I think, part of the forum today. So until that question is asked, then we're not sure of the answer. And then, of course, in the context of the alliance, imagine a world without the US as our primary security guarantor, and not even thinking of ourselves. Think about extended deterrence for Japan and Korea right now. Do they now need their own nuclear weapon in the context of not being assured that the US will fulfil their alliance obligations? What does it mean for Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis Iran? And all of this obviously has an impact on our hemisphere and our own defence and security policy. So, to some degree, we tend to sort of navel-gaze over our own predicament, but the world is now hopelessly interconnected, that this will have consequences in all sorts of ways, that will have alliance obligations with the US. And as an alternate, it is time to spend 6 to 8% of GDP on defence. And we're in a whole new space. It's a pre-history moment if that has to happen.
Thank you, Ian. Now, the kinetic activities are not the only way we have to defend ourselves. And so, Rachel, you're nodding your head sort of resignedly, knowing I'm coming to you. Can you talk about our cyber security? Because that's where, arguably, as Ian says, we are already at war in the cybersphere.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with Ian. It's the badlands out there in cyberspace. There's no doubt that ASD, at least, is in literally hand-to-hand combat every day with bad actors in cyberspace. I think most Australians are predominantly going to be touched by those bad actors actually in the criminal sort of capacity, where criminals who get between small businesses and their clients and change the bank account details on their invoices is actually the number one problem for Australians. And a small business loses on average $50,000 when they're attacked in that way, and usually that's the end of their business. At the other end of the scale, we're seeing increasing amounts of ransomware against Australia, and the average bill for ransomware, if you pay it, is between $9 to $10 million for Australian companies. And ASD, of course, pretty fabulously, I think, this year caught 6 of the Russian cyber criminals who were responsible for the attack on Medibank, and that was only as a consequence of the incredible collaboration with Medibank itself to help unpack what happened there. But it did take ASD 2 years to find those guys, and they're all guys, and take down their servers, which were being used by other criminal gangs against other targets across Australia and across the world. Why does that really matter in this context? Is because the act of being able to do that not only holds criminals to account, so it's somewhat comforting to Australians that it doesn't go totally without consequence, but also as a significant deterrence message to state-based actors who are also all over us in cyberspace. The one that has been most spoken about today and is most prolific in Australia, of course, is the People's Republic of China. And within the last 12 months, ASD has publicly attributed China with doing all sorts of things, the Ministry of State Security spying on Australians and Australian companies, but doing things like using our home office equipment to use as computing power to turn against us. Equally, we've seen Russia here, the FSB. They have been in our critical infrastructure. This is so important, as has Iran, particularly focused on our public health and our health sector. But none of that is as significant or as serious as what we're seeing now, and the US has been magnificent in calling this out explicitly, is the activities by the People's Republic of China to pre-position on critical infrastructure, on water, on energy, on telcos, in order to be able to deny, degrade, disrupt or destroy that critical infrastructure and harm civilians at a time of their choosing. It is ridiculously hard to catch them at it because unlike the more traditional activity of espionage, where at some point data has to move to and fro from a network, that pre-positioned malware can be sat there and left alone and checked up on once or twice a year. So unfortunately, we give them really cool names like Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon. It sounds really cool, but it also sort of puts that commentary into a bucket of one for techie people and nerds, if you will. But I really am concerned that we aren't talking more about this publicly. ASD assessed that it was possible that these actors could be here in Australia and in our critical infrastructure. And in fact, 11% of all cyber attacks reported to ASD in the last year were on our critical infrastructure. So thanks to your beginning, Malcolm, with the 2016 Cyber Security Strategy, which started to put this on the agenda in Australia, which then culminated in a $10 billion investment in ASD under Peter Dutton as Defence Minister, which has been supported by this government. The very foundation of that $10 billion investment is actually about self-reliance, the ability to be able to defend ourselves in cyberspace and fight back without being connected to any of our allies, because that's the nature of how cyberspace will work. I would also add that it wouldn't be for want of our American or other Five Eyes friends and buddies wanting to be there with us, but if we are attacked like that in cyberspace, we may be cut off, we may be on our own, and they will have bigger problems in their own networks. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Thank you. Can I really raise another issue? In terms of greater self-reliance, obviously we will need to make more of our own capabilities, our own munitions and other platforms. Australian defence industry is very small relative to the size of our GDP when you compare to other countries. I mean, Sweden was mentioned, or Poland. Many countries, much smaller economies. I really invite comments on that. Perhaps Perhaps Andrew Bottrell would like to start, if Andrew is still with us. See, yeah, there. Okay, perhaps introduce yourself, General.
Malcolm.
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, Malcolm, thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Bottrell, I ran Sovereign Borders under Malcolm for your second year, but for the last 5 years I ran the land domain for CASG. So I saw up close and personal the issue of competitions getting into industry and the time it was taking for us to get into industry. Having a conversation earlier about some of the projects that, from a defence perspective, that have been delivered with the most ease. We often talk about the delay and the amount of time it takes to go through the competition process and then getting it into industry. Some of the projects that have had the best results have been those where government has actually directed their outcomes. So C-17 is a good example. Self-propelled howitzers that the Koreans are delivering out of Hanwha. Government said to be delivered by this time in this location. Those projects where there is a directive from government have often been the ones that have come to fruition quickly. Now, so that aside, where is defence industry here? Yes, it is small. They talk about it being coin operated. It needs to be funded. It needs to be maintained. What seems to be missing is, notwithstanding the Defence Strategic Review, which I think was a really robust review, flowing from that was a total recut of the Integrated Investment Program, which threw a huge amount of uncertainty into the defence industry environment. And so many of the people represented here who've played on the edge of that now deal with the risk that flows into industry. And so that risk, of course, breeds uncertainty. That uncertainty breeds a lack of willingness to invest in Australia. So, I engage with primes and small and medium enterprises on a regular basis. I said to them before the DSR, if you do not have a diversified approach to your business, you are looking at a almost certain failure post the DSR. Now, there's a view that about at least a third of the small and medium enterprises in Australia have gone to the wall in the defence sector because that uncertainty has just bred that lack of confidence and they've looked elsewhere. Some of that's been declared. Many of them have just quietly gone into adjacent sectors and looked to diversify. Some of the smart ones did go and diversify, and I think about, there's a number of companies, I won't call them out here, but there are a number who have really successfully looked to those adjacent sectors, but they're not looking to defence because they see simply too much uncertainty. And the boulder that is the AUKUS Pillar 1 has displaced so much in the IIP that there is just not enough space for others. And I think about Hanwha, the fact that government took off the Integrated Investment Program, the second regiment for them in the future, all that did was undermine their confidence to invest in the future. And remarkably, they stayed. So, that was a good thing. And we now have a second potential industrial base in Victoria. And that could be magnified by other investments in Victoria as well. But there has to be a will. There may be an investment in the near future in that area to sort of thicken that up again. So there are a couple of areas, but it needs that investment. It needs that leadership to actually to thicken it up and to really invest in it. It is fragile, and I just think it does need. Mick pointed to it earlier. It does need a clearer identification of risk. It needs a longer lead investment in some of these bigger environments. So it's fragile. It needs further investment. It needs, I think, greater leadership and a reform of the acquisition process as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. Sam, you had something to say, and then I wanted to ask, is Alexandra still here? Yeah, there she is. Good.
Well, briefly, I'm a classical liberal when it comes to many economic matters, so I would just say that if Australia does have a comparatively small defence industry, it's because we don't subsidise it as much, and that's probably a good thing. It's very hard to see a future in which the global arms market breaks down to such an extent that we can't buy our weapons overseas when we need them. If there's a comparative advantage to doing it in Australia, then fine. But otherwise, just buy them and stockpile them. If we're worried about getting cut off from global arms supplies in a conflict, then just stockpile them more.
Yep. Okay, Mick.
It is 100% certain we'll be cut off from global arms suppliers in a conflict. 100%, because they'll be using them themselves. We even saw it in the Iraq-Afghanistan wars period that we're at. It took us much longer to get basic things out of the Americans because they were all going to their own forces. So it doesn't have to be some malign strategy. The Americans will always prioritise their own people first. We've been through this before in World War II where we had to build all our own stuff because the Brits and Americans were using their own stuff first, and it will happen again.
Can I ask you a question? I address this to all the military people in the room, which there are many. My impression has always been that at the Pentagon, they regard the advancement of the American military industrial base as absolutely fundamental to American security, but that our own defence establishment does not have the same commitment to the Australian military industrial base. Is that a fair, am I right or wrong? Yeah.
Well, by the amount of money invested, I think you'd say that's true. I think there's a fair bit of propaganda that comes out of Russell about the Australian industrial base, but the amount of money that's invested in it, I think, needs to be increased, but also diversified amongst many different kinds of entities, not just the majors.
Yes, exactly. Now, Alexandra Malloy is a Ukrainian, Australian, and an expert on drones. Tell us about Ukraine's extraordinary achievements in terms of drones, missiles, its indigenous defence industry. And you've written a report for the Australian Army about it, which is a public document.
Thank you so much, Malcolm, and thanks for inviting me, and to the panel as well for great comments, in particular part on the national resilience and national security strategies. I think that's very important. So going back to some numbers and stats, so approximately 70% of recent conflicts are fought with drones or uncrewed systems, if we want to say. So 15 years ago, only 3 countries had armed drones. This has changed in 2024 by 40 countries. In 2025, it's about 102. So the role of uncrewed systems has been absolutely unprecedented in many countries, but also more so in Ukraine. In the air, at land, and at sea. From zero capability in 2022 to the capability of manufacturing, producing, acquiring 5 million drones a year in 2025. And different diversity in drones. So it's not only intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, it's about tactical, it's about long-range capability and strikes that can strike 3,000 kilometers deep inside Russia, as well as loitering munitions, but also for the other points like mining, demining, and the disaster response, if we will. So there is such a range of the uncrewed system that actually has changed the battlefield in Ukraine. And according to the recent report, approximately 2/3 of all capabilities by Russian capability were destroyed by drones by Ukraine. So basically, many countries already take those lessons. They translate in their geography, in their context, and make decisions. They redefine their strategies. They write in their policies for both uncrewed systems, but also counter UAS, as we also need to protect against these threats. And recently, just in March, so US has announced a $50 billion investment into working in uncrewed systems. Lesson learned from Ukraine. UK has revised their strategies and also investing at least $7.6 billion. So as to the recent reports, Japan, 100 billions. South Korea redefining, thinking maybe shifting from buying helicopters into uncrewed systems. So basically many countries around the globe making those shifts into the asymmetric response for relatively cheap and quite an effective capability that can serve along the crew capability. So I think that lessons are continuously learned, and also the ability of Ukraine to adapt and learn, as Mick Ryan was saying, is absolutely important, and it's important to consider as well for Australia. It's important to consider and revise any strategies. Of course, there are some broader RAS AI strategies, that's true, but a lot has changed since 2022, and I think we need to consider those changes, and we need to be able to learn, adapt, and really action on those. not only in theory, but in practice. We have to have those difficult conversations, but we also need to work together with Department of Home Affairs, Foreign Affairs, and so on and so forth, together with defence and also defence industry and the whole community, the whole people, to be able to understand those threats and also know the roles, responsibilities, what to do. We were lucky in Australia that we haven't had any threats from drones as yet, but if we do, we need to be able to work swiftly and make the right decisions. So the question probably to the panel is, what do you think Australia can do now in terms of implementing those uncrewed systems, and where are those champions to change?
Can I just, there's a couple of things there, and Alexandra's report that came out October last year is a superb report, and I recommend it to everyone because this country is a long, long way behind. A couple of key things that the Ukrainians have done we can copy tomorrow, would be within our culture and resources. The Minister for Digital Transformation set up an organisation called Brave One. They're basically the Babel fish between industry and the military for a whole range of technologies, AI, drones, bunch of things. They work with the general staff every week, so they know what the requirements are. They go out, survey the market, find out what the potential solutions are. Those go into the procurement system, but they also go onto a list that units that are crowdfunding can procure direct off that are already approved and also meet all the EW requirements, which generally no foreign solution does. That's one thing. Drones are also an organisation and a cultural response that we just haven't made any real movement on. Every Ukrainian brigade has a drone battalion at least. They now have a independent systems force, unmanned systems force. Sorry, Jen, it's not uncrewed. Unmanned systems force is the official name. But it has become the central nervous system of the entire Ukrainian armed forces. It might be separate organisationally, but it is fully integrated from the battlefield and from the air battle and the maritime battle all the way back to the strategic level into industry. So there's some organisational and cultural ideas, not just technological ones, that we really need to look at that might speed up the absorption of the state of the art in our country.
Where are our defence forces up to in terms of drones? Unmanned systems or uncrewed systems? Or?
Frankly, we're a long way behind. I mean, if you go out to a combat brigade at the moment, I remember with the 3rd Brigade last year, they had a drone fly over and they go, wow, a drone swarm. I said, is that the first time you've seen one? They said, yes. There's a real problem between the technical air safety jiggery-pokery that goes on in this capital and actually getting stuff into units. There's a couple of companies of capability based in Brisbane, and there's been various experiments, but there has been no systemic absorption of drones, no systemic reorganisation to take account of them, and no systemic reorganisation of the tactics, the doctrinal and leadership models that are required for what is coming, which is not using drones, but partnering with them, and partnering with them in their thousands and tens of thousands.
Just as this is a bit of a Dorothy Dixer, but some people would say in our defence community, well, drones are all very important in Ukraine in that sort of, hand-to-hand trench warfare effectively, where our adversaries are likely to be at, much greater distances. Are they relevant in the context of long-range strike?
Absolutely. Now, there's this lovely fantasy that all Australia will ever do is long-range strike. And, I wish that was true. It's just not. There is nothing in the history of warfare that indicates you will fight exactly the way you want against the person you want to fight. Yes, long-range strike matters, but at the end of the day, what happens if it doesn't work? You've got to be able to get up close. But the Ukrainians are building tens of thousands of long-range drones with ranges from hundreds to thousands of kilometres that are designed to penetrate very sophisticated electromagnetic environments because the Russian air defence system is extraordinarily capable, changes every day. Every day. The adaptation cycle between drones and air defence is operating in a 2-week cycle at the moment. I think that is incomprehensible to most bureaucrats.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Please. Yes.
Hello, you can. Hi, I'm Marcus Tellier from Strategic Analysis Australia, but I also work for a great Australian SME that makes long-range uncrewed underwater vessels. So I just want to kind of bring a couple of points together. So Dennis said people don't have plan Bs. When I think about plan Bs in the submarine space, in the AUKUS Pillar 1 space, I'm not talking yet another submarine project, whether that's instead of or as well as. I'm talking about doing other stuff that will guarantee we can deliver the military effects that we want from submarines, but we can do it in case the submarine program falls over. And if the submarine program does deliver, then we've got multiple options to deliver those effects. On Mike's thing, the question, should we dump our American stuff? Clearly the answer is no. But just because we can't be 100% self-sufficient in Australia doesn't mean we shouldn't try to be more sufficient in Australia. And our friends in Ukraine have taught us that even medium economies can go a very long way in becoming more self-sufficient. Your question, Malcolm, about what can Australian industry do? Australian industry can do a lot. We keep convincing ourselves, we look at the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity and go, well, we're 100 on that, we're behind Botswana, we can't do anything. I can give you a long lecture on why that is total bullshit, but I won't. What I will say is we have great industrial capability here already. It's just it tends to be focused on things like supporting the mining industry and not making handbags. All of that industrial capacity supporting the mining industry can be turned to supporting defence industry very easily. There is a huge overlap in skill sets. On this issue, again, this other issue of do drones help in the Indo-Pacific, I can tell you right now that we already have the capability to project power with drones thousands of kilometres. So sorry for the pitch, but C2 Robotics has designed and built an underwater drone with thousands of kilometres of range, and it can carry militarily useful payloads. You can use your own imagination about what you would like to deliver to 2 or more thousand kilometres over the Indo-Pacific, but we could do that already if the ADF bought it, but it exists already. So that is here today. Speartooth, our drone, is basically an underwater Tesla, uses the same batteries as a EV. Last year, China made over 10 million EVs. So if we can do something like Speartooth, they can do it at scale. So to get back to the relevance of submarines question, I think the issue of will the seas become transparent or not is an irrelevant question. I think the main problem is how are your submarines going to survive when they're at home in port? Because again, as we've seen from Ukraine, if you can be seen, you can be targeted. If you can be targeted, you'll be killed. So I have profound doubts about the survivability of submarines into the 30s and 40s. Now, bringing all of that stuff together gets back to my kind of happy place, which is the defence budget. You can't do all of that stuff on 2% of GDP. You can't do it. So our defence budget has hovered around 2-ish% of GDP for about 6 or 7 years. It's going to stay there for a few more years. Talking about the historic increases to defence spending that it's made. They don't really cut in for a few more years, and when they do, it's simply funding the SSN program, okay? I'm agnostic on the SSN program, but what you can see already, it is the giant expanding blob that is eating everything. Okay, already last year we spent $3.5 billion on the SSN program. This year it's meant to be $3.8 billion on the SSN program. Best case, we're still 7 to 8 years away from having the submarine. So, that number is growing exponentially. Probably by about 2030, we'll be spending $10 billion a year on the SSN program before we actually have an SSN capability. So, you can't do that on 2% of GDP. It is eating other capabilities. let alone giving us the ability to invest in the small, the smart, the many, the kinds of things that Mick Ryan's been talking about. You know, you can see that in the National Defence Strategy funding line. Maritime capabilities are 38% of our investment in the National Defence Strategy. That is more than land capabilities, air capabilities, and cyber capabilities combined. That is how unbalanced our defence investment has become. So we all have views on what we should be spending defence dollars on. The bottom line is, I think, we are not spending enough of them, and we're not spending enough soon enough. The funding line we have for this year, essentially, is the same funding line that came out of the 2016 white paper. You know, that trajectory that we got almost 10 years ago has remained unchanged. It's only sort of, as we get down the track a bit, when the AUKUS submarine dollars start ramping up, that we see a change there. So, you know, I don't think I'm alone here in thinking the world has fundamentally changed since 2016, but defence funding hasn't in that model. So we have to do a lot more sooner, you know, and just, you know, when you look at NATO, so 2% was the benchmark for spending in NATO. Yeah, I'll wrap it up. If you're Belgium, however, you can rely on, even if the US leaves, you've still got 5 of the top 10 GDPs in the world supporting you. You've got Germany, France, Italy, UK, and Canada. We have New Zealand, okay? So I don't think 2% cuts it anymore. Sorry, I'll stop there.
No, that's all right. That's great, Marcus. Thank you very much. And your expertise and about these issues, and particularly the defence budget, are, you know, appreciated and admired by everyone. Can I just, as an FYI, Marcus was talking about, you know, a no submarine option under AUKUS Pillar 1 and buying other capabilities. The best place to see that fleshed out is in the Congressional Research Service's paper on AUKUS, and just in a nutshell, you know, they actually proposed this. This is their idea, forward rotations of UK and US SSNs to Australia under Pillar 1 to Sterling, Surf West would still be implemented. Additional Virginia-class boats would be built, but for the US Navy, and they would be retained in US service and operated out of Australia, so we'd have no submarines, but we would provide a base and service them and maintain them, so we'd be, you know, supporting our American friends. And then Australia, instead of using the funds to purchase, build, operate and maintain its own submarines, would instead invest those funds in other military capabilities, such as, for example, long-range anti-ship missiles, drones, loitering munitions, B-21 long-range bombers, etc. So that is the kind of no submarine, you know, that is, I think, in reality what Plan B is, although no one wants to, in Australia at least, own up to it. So, anyway, we are 5 minutes to go. Yes, please, Charles Edel from CSIS.
Yes, Charles Edel, CSIS. Sorry for the imposition of an American accent. It's been great to have the conversation all day today. I thought... That's right, you don't want to hear the other take. I actually thought that the Plan B was not what you just quoted. I thought the Plan B was the conversation that's beginning to evolve about what else and what more. So let me throw out a frame of reference for what defense of Australia looks like, and I'd love to have the panelists chime in about where this doesn't work as a frame, and where it does, how you would fill up the bucket. 3 different categories. Number 1, as challenging as the US is, and as more challenging as we're going to become, which things do you want to accelerate more quickly with the United States? Frame 2, without the United States, as we've been discussing, which efforts do you plan on accelerating? Diplomatic, strategic, defense, and otherwise. And frame 3, things that Australia can do without any other country, probably starting with defense budget, what does Australia need to accelerate itself? Again, my vantage point simply being the larger conversation, which I think you've prompted very nicely here, is what does Defence of Australia mean and what does Australia put into it? And it's not simply an AUKUS conversation.
Comment?
Well, if I think I've, help me if I've misunderstood the question, but where I would start with the United States is on simply beefing up our ability to sink ships and to down aircraft and missiles. So I'm glad we're buying LRASM. I'm glad we're investing finally, belatedly, in mine warfare a little bit. So I'd like to, I'm sure the United States can be of great help on securing Australia's sea and air approaches to our north. Absent the US alliance, I think the absolute priority needs to be on securing Australia's immediate region, and that means a much closer relationship with Indonesia. I wrote an article in the middle of last year for Australian Foreign Affairs calling for an alliance with Indonesia. And then secondly, I would further step up in the Pacific with the ultimate ambition of, rather than competing with China to win over Pacific Island countries for influence, is to put an end to that competition by essentially enmeshing the Pacific Island countries in a kind of Pacific Union. That would be my ultimate aim.
Mick or Ian, do you want to?
I just go back to my comments. We've got to start at what do we want from a national security perspective before we drill down into military. I mean, too often in this country, defence is just military stuff, and I think there's far more to that, and we need a broader, more sophisticated discussion. And we need to have this conversation about 2% or 3% or 4%. I mean, in 2035, at the moment, the ADF will be 3 Virginias and 2 dogs. I mean, that's what's going to happen if we don't have a serious... 2 dogs.
2 dogs?
Or maybe 3.
Okay.
But I overstate the case, but that's how much this project is going to eat the ADF from the inside if we don't have a realistic conversation about the true costs of a modern military capability in this country outside of the SSN.
Yep, and just to reinforce my colleagues, I think separating the ASA from the defence budget will be a useful first step. Then you can make real judgments around what's happening in every other component of military power beyond undersea. I think FMS of an air and missile defence system is critical. And again, I'm not solutionising, but in the context of where the threat is evolving. Again, Mike Pizzullo would like this. I remember Richard Armitage came and spoke to us between the 09 and 13 white papers. And rather condescendingly, he said, you guys have designed for every threat but which one that you face, which is a Taedong 2 out of North Korea. You've got no defence for it. We rely on AWD at the moment. There's only 3 of them. That's a problem. So I think there's a military problem there that needs to be solved. Australia's got great convening power in this part of the world. The Quad, the G7, the PIC, APEC. We talk about punching above our weight. There's also leading above our weight. And I think, again, our friends and partners across the region are looking for us to do that. And then the last bit is in the context of what is our own 9-dash line, and I don't mean that in a physical context, but if you understand what A2AD actually is, anti-access is soft power, so it's friends and diplomacy and other mechanisms of national power to be able to control certain geographies, and area denial is hard power and smart power. So the A2AD that we need, the 9-dash line that we need, is cognitive in the sense that what policy settings do we need, what are we prepared to live with, and more importantly, what are we prepared to draw a line under when it comes to exercising national power in this part of the world. Thanks.
And Ian, you've just recently published a book dealing with exactly this issue and the very innovative way you think Australia should deal with it.
Yeah,
you want
thanks.
to just mention the book?
Well, it's called Let's Trade Not Argue. It's a collaboration with Bob Breen, and essentially what we're thinking about is a version of ourselves where we can use smart power to our benefit. So it's about cultivating friends and relationships to be able to position for advantage and effectively shape foreign policy. And in the event where response options are required, then we sort of invoke and necessitate self-reliance, self-defence that not only relies on military hard power, but also utilises soft power, friends, allies, in the way that the Allied Intelligence Bureau tried to emulate in the Second World War.
Well, thank you all very much. We're going to have a break now, and I just want to thank everyone again, panellists and everyone in the room. And I just note that it just shows the potency of this threat. The terror it inspires is that it has not actually been named, because all of us here know that the real threat that keeps the Defence Department awake late at night is not any of the parties named today, but rather the Australian National Audit Office.